Institute of Chinese Studies, and Department of International Relations and Governance Studies, Shiv Nadar University. We shall now begin the proceedings of the third thematic panel titled In Flux, Political Economy. Chairing this panel is Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay. He is an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies. He is also a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research since 2006. He was previously part of the founding team at the Infrastructure Development Finance Company, IDFC, focusing on private participation in infrastructure. In previous positions, he has been with the Export-Import Bank of India and with the World Bank in Washington. His research interests are in urbanization, infrastructure, and the development path of India and China. The discussant for this session is Dr. Titli Basu, Associate Fellow, East Asia Center, Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. The introductions of the speaker are attached in the chat box for your reference. Before I invite the chair to begin the proceedings, let me lay out the housekeeping rules. All participants, except for the speaker, shall be muted for the duration of the event. Participants are requested to send in their questions via the chat box or use the raise hand option. Please unmute yourself only when called upon to do so by the chair. I shall now invite the chair to begin the proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much. And Surbhi, it's lovely to start this on a Tuesday morning and the first AICEAS conference. And thank you, Sandeep, for having me here. And thank you, Titli, for joining us and the speakers. We will begin the program. Basically, as we go together, I'll keep this short. There is a complex mix of papers that are out there. And let me begin by asking Radha to start her presentation. We'll have 10 minutes for that. She'll be speaking on an empirical analysis of trade relations between India and ASEAN. And it's a paper that's written jointly with Professor Sheela and Captain Singh. So Dr. Raghuramapatruni, I'm sorry, Radha, but for that slight mispronunciation. So if you could begin now, and about 10 minutes for your presentation. We have 5 papers, so we'll try and keep this short, and then so that we have sufficient time for questions going forward. Okay, so is it clear now? Is it clearer now?
You're audible, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, is it clearer now?
Yes, so you're audible.
Thank you. Radha, are you ready to present? Who would be presenting from that group? Is it Sheela, Radha, or Captain Singh? So, Radha, would you like to switch on your video?
Should we go?
Professor Raghuramapatruni is the Chairperson and Associate Professor at the Department of International Business at GITAM Institute of Management, GITAM University in Visakhapatnam. So, is there an issue with unmuting her?
Hello, am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
And
sorry, sir, for this technical.
if you can be visible too, that would be nice. But if it is not an issue, then yes, wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor.
Sir, my video is also on.
Yeah.
Let me share the screen if I can.
Perfect.
Please give me the option for sharing my screen. It says host disable the screen sharing. Can I get the screen sharing option?
I think they're working.
Yes.
Good.
Yes. Yes.
Perfect. Look
So,
forward to that.
very good morning, respected Chairperson, respected dignitaries from Institute of Chinese Studies, dignitaries from Sheela University, and all the respected participants. Myself, Radha Raghuramapatruni, extremely sorry for that technical hit. So, paper is on. It's an empirical analysis of trade relations between India and Association of South Asia, authored by Professor Sheela Paluri and Captain Yugesh Singh. So with this small presentation of the abstract and of today's paper. So if you observe India's new growth story, it is a direct result of a conscious change with respect to an inward-looking strategy till the year 1991. But following the macro crisis, we have Am I audible, sir?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Sorry, there is a power cut. So initially we started on with the inward-looking strategy. We switched over to an outward-looking strategy. So as a part of this outward-looking strategy, India started to revitalize its trade and economic.
Dr. Raghuramapatruni, we can't hear you now.
Yeah. If I'm permitted, frequent power cuts with some problem with Wi-Fi. Can I present as a second presentation or so? I log in from my mobile.
We will share the audio and you can switch off your video. We will share the PowerPoint presentation and you can switch off your video. Then at least
I'll log in from my mobile, sir.
Fine. Please do it.
Yes, go ahead.
I'll log in from my mobile and I'll come.
Perfect. Your screen, if you can just mail your presentation across to Surbhi or
Dr. Partha, we already have a copy ready. I can share it now.
Then it's fine. Then we are all set.
So you can just speak it out, then the bandwidth would be better.
Perfect.
Yes. I'm just logging out. I'll log in from my mobile.
Just take it. No rush.
Hi, Rija.
Hello. Sir, I would like to continue.
Go ahead.
Sir. So in this particular paper, so we to present the abstract. So during till the year 1991, country had been adopting a inward-looking strategy. So this inward-looking strategy is switched over to an outward-looking strategy following the macro crisis in the year 1991. So India started revitalizing its trade and economic relations with its East Asian neighbors as a part of Look East policy strategy. So this particular Look East policy strategy initiative, it had not only an important bearing on the total volume of India's trade, but it also had an important implication on its domestic economic situation. So if you observe, this LEP strategy has been quite successful. It had a sizable impact on the total volumes of trade that we were doing with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations trade relations. And there have been some dynamic changes and significant accomplishments to reach the year 2017. So in the year 2017, India and ASEAN completed their 25 years of their togetherness, and we celebrated 25 years of our Look East policy strategy. So this LEP strategy has been morphed into an Act East policy strategy. If you observe, India and ASEAN today account for 1.8 billion of the total population, and a combined GDP of India and ASEAN region is 3 trillion. For India, ASEAN is a very important and significant trade partner, 4th largest trade partner. And if you observe, in India's total volume of trade, 10.4% of the trade is accounted to the ASEAN region. So in this particular given background, we try to attempt and analyze the existing trade, that is export-import relations between India and ASEAN nations. At the same time, also identify the commodity trade potential that could be further be tapped between both the economies. So once this commodity trade potential is identified, the stability of this commodity trade potential is also tested, and also the correlation analysis between the different indices that we have identified is also being observed. So following the year till the year 2018, when the Look East policy is morphed into Act East policy, the summit level interactions between the India and ASEAN nations. So these summit level interactions ended with the Delhi Declaration. And this Delhi Declaration is signed by the ASEAN leaders, at the same time India. So this Delhi Declaration has many significant agreements. So important agreements in the year 2018 to be mentioned are the agreements with respect to Indo-Pacific Vision Agreement, and also the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative Agreement, and ASEAN Outlook of Indo-Pacific Agreement. So all these agreements have a very important bearing with respect to not only Indo-Pacific region, but also world at large. So one significant point to write this particular paper is, as we are celebrating one of the most important accomplishment of our country, Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. So we shall be completing 75 years of our independence. So at this particular point of time, we also will be completing 30 years of our trade and economic engagements with our ASEAN neighbors. So this particular point of time is very essential to intensify, accelerate, further tap the potential of trade, economic, social, cultural, very important security relations between both the nations. So other significant point is after many important incidents that happen in the world. For example, if you observe the First World War or the Second World War, we have seen there is a complete change with respect to the multilateral trading institution setup. Similarly, the regional grouping setup. So after the Second World War, we have seen there could be a more integrated Europe and closer Europe that could be observed. So today also we also try to incorporate some of the current incidents that are happening. For example, the current geopolitical situations, crisis that we are looking at, the Russia and Ukrainian crisis. I think this is a time that as after the Second World War, Europe has been much more integrated, much more became close. I think this is a time that country, India, can lead the Asian region together to start with ASEAN and also bring together all the economies of Asia. So a more integrated Asia, more closer Asia, and more peaceful Asia that is going to play a very dynamic role in the world. I think with this background, our paper tried to assess the India-ASEAN commodity trade relations, and also identify the commodity trade potential, and also test the commodity trade potential for the future trading scenario. So this is the background of our paper. With this background, we have actually reviewed 15 studies for our paper. Most important studies of review of literature have been mentioned. I would like to mention two, three important studies. So one important study is of RIS, Research and Information System Study, which says that a closure integration between India and ASEAN is possible, and also there is a huge trade potential that could be tapped between India and the ASEAN region. And other important finding from their RIS systems is they have found out that the problems with respect to India and ASEAN, there are many common problems, and these common problems, they could be collective solutions, and at the same time they could be a strategy that could be designed for the resilient economies of ASEAN and India. And one other study is Bang's study, that is also in the year 2021. So this particular study also finds that it's a very interesting and significant study, I would say, because they try to assess and forecast the performance of regional comprehensive economic cooperation, the world's largest FTA that is signed between ASEAN, Australia, India, New Zealand, and Japan, China. So after 8 years of negotiation, this RCEP agreement has been signed. So they tried to forecast and found out that RCEP is going to benefit larger economies like China and Japan, whereas the smaller emerging economies, ASEAN, are going to actually lose out. So this is one interesting forecast.
You have 4 minutes, Dr. Radha.
Sir?
You have 4 minutes.
Sure, sir. Sure, sir. I shall try to complete.
Sure.
So this is one interesting study I thought I shall be mentioning. At the same time, the other reviewers also found out that we are having a trade deficit with respect to Chinese economy. So this trade deficit, could be completed by replacing the commodities that we are importing from China with respect to from the ASEAN economies. So with this review of literature, the importance of this particular current study that we have done is it tries to find out the commodity trade potential, test the commodity trade potential that could be further reaped for benefit of both the economies. And with respect to the methods that we have adopted, the data has been extracted from the secondary sources like United Nations Comtrade, World Trade Organization, Directorate of Trade Statistics, and the Commerce and Industry website of our country. The secondary data has been used, and the time period for the study that we have taken is from the year 1995 to the year 2020. We tried to analyze, and the models that we have adopted, I think you can see from the presentation. So the models that we have adopted are the gravity model, initially to understand total volume of the trade that has been taking place between India and the ASEAN 10. Then the initial export intensity, import intensity also has been tested. So along with this, the most important crux of our study is finding the comparative advantage index. For that, initially we have used the B value given by Balasa. Along with that, revealed export advantage, revealed import advantage, and finally the log of revealed export advantage and revealed competitiveness index is identified and is tested. So initially to find out the competitiveness index between India and ASEAN 10. And the total commodities we have taken are the 50 commodities following 9 different commodity categories. Similarly, the testing of these stability of these indices is also tested, and how this index has been distributed over a period of time. And dictonomous test also tries to identify the relation between different indices that we have found out. So this is a model that we have adopted. And following the gravity model, trade intensity and export intensity index, import intensity index, all of them show that the total value of TII, EII, and also the gravity coefficient is more than 1, showing that India is connected with the ASEAN economies, and this connection has been positive, following the sign more than one. Similarly, with respect to commodity trade potential that we have tested, we found out that the total Balasa index out of 50 commodities that we have taken, 23 commodities have the value is more than one, showing commodity trade potential. Similarly, the revealed competitiveness index also identifies that totally 9 commodities the trade potential could be tapped. And with respect to how this commodity trade potential is distributed over a period of time, because in a time period A, country may have commodity trade potential, but we may lose at a time period B. So this is tested through the stability index. And we have found that over a period of time, not much disturbance, and the stability of this commodity trade potential has been carried out over a period of time. Similarly, the distribution of B value also shows that more than 50% for whole of the time period that we have taken for the study, which shows that there is a commodity trade potential that could be tapped between both the countries. Similarly, the dictonomous test, which shows a correlation between different country pairings, that also finds that more than 40% of the pairings have been matching. So which shows that there is a commodity trade potential, it is stable over a period of time. Similarly, the dictonomous test also shows a positive correlation between the pairings. We have totally done 6 pairings, 6 different time periods, and 6 different pairings. So overall, we found that there is a commodity trade potential that could be tapped. And ASEAN ASEAN is a significant trade partner, and the commodity trade potential could be further be tapped following the global value chains. And India could be a significant trade partner to ASEAN economies, because post-COVID, there is a situation and gap that has been created, and this gap could be successfully fulfilled by the commodity trade that we can intensify with the ASEAN nations. So, and the future, India is going to lead. So to start with ASEAN and taking all the economies together, and to show the world that Asian, more integrated, more closer, and more peaceful Asia for the world peace. Thank you, sir. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm extremely sorry for the technical.
Thank you so much, Dr. Radha.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
The next presenter is, if you have questions for any of the speakers that you feel is a burning question, please post them in the chat box so that you don't lose your train of thought. But we will essentially take questions after the discussant has made her remarks going forward. So the next presenter is Shubhangi. Shubhangi Jain, are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Shubhangi Jain will be presenting on the political economy of climate change in South Korea, from green growth to green transformation. Shubhangi, 10 minutes, and then I'll give you a heads up at 6 and buzzer at 10.
Just a second, there's some error here. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is. You might want to make it full screen. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking AICEAS and Shiv Nadar University for giving me this opportunity. And now I'll begin with my paper. So my paper is titled Political Economy of Climate Change in South Korea, from Green Growth to Green Transformation. The background is that the 6th report by IPCC confirms that climate change is now inevitable, irreversible, leaving only a decade to radically restructure our relationship with nature. In line with this, the Korean New Deal, National Strategy for a Great Transformation, proposed in 2020, is seen as an innovative response to its economic recovery post-COVID-19. Now, there are 3 research objectives. The paper has sought to assess whether the aimed green transformation is a just transition through the lens of political economy of climate change. It has further sought to evaluate the contradictions that capitalist societies face in responding to the adaptation of climate policies, and finally to assess the lessons that earlier green growth strategy of South Korea offers for this new green transformation. Now, why political economy? Because political economy approaches help to unfold the drivers of projects to pursue decarbonization, Critical economy of climate change describes the processes by which ideas, power, and resources are conceptualized, negotiated, and implemented by different groups at different scales. And critical economy perspective helps examine the structures of production, which is technologies, distribution, which is through markets, and consumption, which is through positioning and pricing. Now, the logic of climate change and capitalism are always in constant tension with each other, and the modern energy paradigm, which is reflected, has always thought of seeing nature as a commodified subsystem of the human economy. The post-pandemic recovery policies hence have presented an opportunity to rethink our developmental models and disaster responses. And one such is the Green New Deal, which is a subset of the Korean New Deal. At the heart of this Green Deal is the transformation of key consumption and production systems in the economy, which is energy, transport, buildings, and food. And it aims to rebuild the post-COVID damaged economy with a focus on green transformation. This official document states the pandemic is expected to change people's behavior and perceptions and ultimately bring structural changes to economies and societies the world over. These structural changes include rising demand for untaxed services, a growing call for an environmentally friendly economy, and a rapid labor market changes that widen polarization. As a result of such changes, government action is essential to accelerate the transition towards a digital economy, drive the shift towards a green economy, and alleviate the polarization. Now, why green transformation in South Korea? Green transformation refers to radical shifts to enable sustainable practices. It is also seen as a response to a sense of crisis in states' more conventional environmental governance roles and the desire to lead a transitioning world order. And why South Korea? Because South Korea is the 7th largest national CO2 emitter, which is enabled by its huge investments in coal-based plants, particularly in Southeast Asia. Its highest nuclear power plant density, lowest renewable generation, and highest concentration of PM 2.5 among the OECD countries. Now, the Green New Deal. It is fundamentally a set of policy recommendations addressing climate change and environmental protection while revitalizing the economy. There are 8 goals that the Green New Deal seeks to assess, which I have written down here. And the government projects that a total of 73.4 trillion Korean won will be invested and 6,59,000 jobs will be created. Now, how do we make a case for just transitions? A just transition framework has to be explored through a political economy lens, which advances the notion beyond worker protections, addresses energy access and poverty, and adopting climate justice goals. For example, in New Zealand, the inclusion of indigenous people in decision-making, like resource development and establishing recognition, procedural, distributional justice happened. So this was an example of just transitions. Coalition building and information sharing, community-centric, co-productive approaches are also seen as one of them. Now, is there a just transition in Korea? Does it seem there's going to be a just transition in Korea? A concrete policy effort needs to be seen yet. The Korean New Deal has not suggested detailed measures on how it is going to do so. It has only mentioned measures to support businesses in case of industrial transition. There is a need for restructuring just transition governance, which goes beyond the current agendas of Economic, Social, and Labor Council. And it should not be limited to compensation, but should enhance both economic equality, social justice, and be a catalyst to create more and better green jobs, as well as move towards the green industry. An energy transition vision must incorporate an understanding of the needs of the future generation and global environmental risk. And this lies in conflict of values of which South Korea is a representative, that is the developmental state model that it follows. Moreover, the only emission reduction target specified is 16.2 million tons, which is less than the target emphasized in the 2030 National Greenhouse Gas Reduction Implementation Plan. There are a lot of existing policies. However, they seem to be independent of each other. Although having a common motivation, they need to be brought together to move towards a circular economy, which is an aim that South Korea seeks to achieve. And only 21.5% is allocated to the establishment of renewable energy infrastructure and the energy transition support. Now, what are the contradictions that green industrial policies and this particular policy reflects? It is, especially in South Korea, the links that are formed over decades are based on politics, bureaucracy, and business, which is dominated by personal networks and decades-long practices of corporatist coordinations. Therefore, these green industrial policies are an extension of those strategies. The green growth of 2009 had green infrastructure, green industrial policies at its key elements. The goal was not to reconcile environment and growth, but to increase economic growth and export of green technologies. Therefore, green growth was part of a deep marketization of the global economy following the 2008 financial crisis. Also, the $25 billion Four River Restoration Project, which was announced, was prone to collusion and created more environmental problems than it solved. And the environmental movement was too weak to balance those interests and persuade the public for behavioral changes. Now, what are the lessons from green growth that this Green New Deal must adopt? That there is an attitude towards strong developmentalism. There are distortions in energy markets and political polarizations. That is why South Korea's energy transition has been facing a backseat. Civil society has launched a number of opposition movements identifying the project as being concerned with killing and not restoring the river. As investments in green domestic technology and industries have far outpaced the domestic demand for green products, the green industry was from the beginning an export industry. Two essential differences between the green growth that it was and Green New Deal that it promises to be are that green growth was an economic and focused on economic growth and low carbon society, whereas Green New Deal promises to move towards sustainability, a net zero carbon society with emphasis on urgency. Green growth had green marketization and an export-led approach. Green New Deal calls for designing a post-carbon economy. The way forward, therefore, is combining all the lessons that Green New Deal should learn from green growth and sort of also has, but the top-down approach by the governments and corporations and the bottom-up infused by the civil society organizations have to be brought together, and there should be a synthesis of the two. So the Korean Green New Deal is missing out on these synthesis. It must also dealing the chaebol and the state to lead the green way, incorporate grassroots stakeholders to ensure its sustainability. It is because the bureaucrats and the corporatists in South Korea have a very strong hold on policy making. And the existing capitalist model of development has heavily relied on the more, the better and extraction of resources. Therefore, this aimed green transformation can only be achieved when economy and nature are ceased to be seen as two binaries. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shubhangi. That was well within time. Your paper does have a number of details about the policy, and hopefully that will come up in the discussion. The next speaker who is on the this time is Rajdeep. Rajdeep will be presenting on Mongolia. Gauging the importance of electoral reforms and evolving procedural democracy in Mongolia. He's a PhD scholar at the Center for India and ASEAN Studies at the School of International Studies at Jawaharlal University. Rajdeep, same rules, which is I'll try and give you a heads up at about 6 minutes, and then just before your time stops at about 9 minutes, I'll give you another heads up so that you can maintain time. Please, do you have a presentation to share?
Yeah, sir. Okay. Thank you very much, sir. Thanks to ICS as well as Sheela University for hosting the conference as well as providing an opportunity to present my paper. So I will start with, I will share my screen and then we'll go with the slides. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are.
Okay. My topic is gauging the importance of electoral reforms in evolving procedural democracy in Mongolia. This is the political map of Mongolia, and as we can see, it is sandwiched between Russia and China. The central theme of the research paper is to analyze.
Rajdeep, I don't think your presentation is moving, so you might want to go to a full screen and then see if the presentation is.
Okay, sir.
You're currently still, at least for us, you're still on the title page.
Okay, sir. Let me check.
Rajit, do you want us to share the presentation?
Rajit, that might be a simpler way of doing it. Let ICS share the presentation and you can present the audio.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just remind us when to switch over to the next slide.
Yes, sir. My topic is regarding the importance of electoral reforms involving procedural democracy in Mongolia. This is the political map of Mongolia, and as we can see, it is sandwiched between Russia and China. Sir, kindly in the slide. The central theme of the research paper is to analyze the democratic evolution, especially the procedural aspect in the context of the electoral reforms in Mongolia. Tracing the trajectory of elections since 1996 till 2020, the research paper tries to highlight as how the electoral reforms in post-communist Mongolia since 1996 have guided the electoral mechanism in such a way that it has strengthened the democratic ideals in the region. The research paper also deals with major debates pertaining to the electoral reforms in Mongolia. Just a minute. I will minimize it. Yes, sir. My hypothesis is regarding that subsequent electoral reforms and changing electoral system have boosted the procedural dimension of democracy in Mongolia. As we can see that Mongolia has set an example of being the most successful democracy among the post-communist states of Inner Asia, which points to the fact that optimism towards implementing democratic norms in domestic and foreign policies works satisfactorily despite various challenges. Since the inception of democracy, one distinguishing feature which forms its core is the quest for equal liberty. This equal liberty can be better defined as the participation by the people in the decision-making process without being discriminated on any grounds and making equal contribution to the establishment of majority view. Procedural democracy could be defined as the framework of rules and institutions which are necessary for the development of the society at large. A wide range of institutions like free and fair elections, freedom of expression, rule of law, separation of powers, in order to have a proper check and balance among institutions like legislature, executive, and the judiciary, could be attributed to procedural democracy. Kindly change the slide. Analyzing the trajectory or evolution of democratic transition in Mongolia, we found that the adoption of new constitution, the fourth one since 1921, on January 13, 1992, replacing the 1960 constitution, was a major milestone in the democratic consolidation of the country. It considerable changes in Mongolia's political system with greater emphasis on the establishment of democracy, contrary to the previous constitutions, which had stressed on building the state through socialism. So kindly change the slide. In terms of methodology, the study makes use of both the primary sources like the governmental data and reports and the secondary sources like newspapers, journals, and internet sources. Deductive and inductive approaches along with analytical method have been employed so as to make the study more comprehensive. Now, the very important question worth exploring is regarding the decisive factor that determines the very nature of the state of democracy in any country. In other words, what is the procedural exercise that ensures the innate nature of democratic trajectory in a given state and time period? Unanimously, there is near consensus that the best constitutive factor that determines the core of democracy could be seen in terms of electoral output, and hence corollary to this, the elections are considered as the best innate exercise through which the electorate get the opportunity to exercise the democratic choice. The major debates regarding electoral reforms in Mongolia could be seen as swinging between the two demands of representation and effectiveness. So kindly change the slide. The most important socio-political financial issues around which the debates concerning electoral reforms in Mongolia have revolved could be outlined as follows. Number one, making representation more representative. This called for eliminating the undue structural advantage to the party, especially MPRP, and ensuring better representation of women, ensuring the representation of Kazakh minorities, and making the electoral exercise a fair game for smaller parties, and reforming financial system for parliamentary elections. Demand for representation. After the first parliamentary election of 1992, which was based on the block voting system, the Democratic Party realized that the block voting system requiring multi-member constituency-based election in the 26 districts of Mongolia had been unduly favorable to the MPRP and detrimental to the opposition parties. The electoral rules were revised and amended for the second time in 1996. The electoral system was changed from the multi-member constituency plurality system to first past the post system. Hence, the number of electoral constituencies were demarcated into separate 76 single-member constituencies rather than the previously 26 districts with multi-member constituencies. The 1996 elections were a major turning point as it brought with it a kind of paradigm shift in the nature and pattern of electoral dimensions of the country by bringing a kind of coalition unique and first of its kind in Mongolia. The electoral system before 2008 parliamentary elections changed from single-member constituency-based FPTP system to multi-member electoral constituency-based block voting system. Besides, the changes were made with constitution and no proper deliberation over the proposed changes in electoral system was held. Consequently, the electoral outcomes of 2008 parliamentary elections led to massive violence in Mongolia. Keeping these factors in mind, a parliamentary committee consisting of members from all the parties elected for SGH, that is State Great Hural, in 2008 election was constituted with the mandate to propose a comprehensive and effective reform measures in the electoral system in Mongolia. The parliamentary committee, after mammoth consultation of 3 years, finally submitted the reform proposals in December 2011. Finally, Mongolia on December 14, 2011 adopted and operationalized the new revised electoral law that stipulated a transition from the existing majoritarian FPTP or block voting system to mixed member majoritarian cum proportional representative system. So kindly change the slide. So kindly change the slide. Okay, consequently, the electoral outcomes, sir, it is done. Kindly change it. Sir, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible, Rajdeep. I think they're having some issue with the screen sharing. It will, the second thing will come on.
Okay, sir.
Just give me a minute. I'll share the presentation.
Yes.
You have about 4 minutes left, Rajdeep.
Yes, sir. I will try to complete within that time.
If you tell Rangoli the slide number, then it
will. Rajdeep, stop me when it's all right.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let it be. Okay. The main features of the revised electoral laws can be understood through the following. These are the provisions. As I have a constraint of time, so I will skip it. Just change the slide. This ensures for better representation of women as well as the better representation of Kazakh minorities. And as we can say, that it was only after the substances in the electoral laws in 2012 which led to the electoral success and better representation of the Kazakh minority in Mongolia. Just change the slide. This is the outcome of 2012 parliamentary elections. Just change the slide. The results of 2012 parliamentary elections showed that Mongolia was able to overcome the plot of emergency and came out of it in a mature way, providing a rainbow coalition of the Democratic Party, MPRP, MNDP, Justice Coalition, and the Civil Will Green Party. And these are some of the provisions which, like consequent to the decision of the Constitutional Court, the proportional element was declared ultra vires, and all the 76 seats were decided to be contested in single seat constituency. Following that, the legislative elections took place on 29 June 2017. Can you change the slide? This is the outcome of 2016 parliamentary elections, where we find that MPP bagged 65 seats and DP was Democratic Party was restricted to 9 seats. Just change the slide. Hence, one may find that whatever with the electoral manipulation and institutional weakness, the fact that the electoral outcome completely routed DP is testimony of the resilience of democratic ideals in the country. Just change the slide. There are some of the amendments, like a second set of amendments based on public engagement and deliberation were approved to the 1992 Constitution, November 2017. Then there was another important point to reckon with was regarding last-minute electoral laws manipulation by the Parliament. Even in 2016 elections, we found that the laws were drastically changed when only less than 2 months were left. This was done so as to get a kind of unpredictability in order to suit the nefarious design of the ruling party. However, the amendments prohibited the adoption of alteration of electoral laws within a year of regular election, making the democracy more participatory. It has been provision that for the formation party, at least 1% of eligible voters should support that party. This clause will enter into force on 1st January 2028, and we change it. This is the outcome of 2020 parliamentary elections, where we found that MPP got 62 seats and DP was restricted to 11 seats only. Which in the slide. Another important is the financial issue in electoral reform. The financial disparity is a factor in hampering the electoral misfortunes of majority of the parties, except a few have informed the electoral debates since day one of the democratic Mongolia. Thus, demands to bring laws regarding financial aspects in the elections were strongly desired by majority of the political parties. Consequently, Parliament passed a law wherein General Election Commission. Okay. Similarly, the law on political parties direct that the source of funding to the political parties in Mongolia would be membership fees, fundraising activities, donations. These all are the amendments which try to bring some financial transparency in the for the electoral process. There have been continuous efforts since 2012 for reforming the financial framework of the country. Just in the slide. These are some of the provisions with regard to the public funding, private donations, and spending limits, like provisioning of funding for extra parliamentary parties having considerable electoral support. In order to support and promote female and youth candidates, a certain portion of the political parties' public subsidies will be earmarked. Regulations of in-kind donations based on an monetary appraisal criteria, both during and outside election period. Just in the slide. Ceiling regarding individual donations to increase and that of corporate donations be limited with due consideration of prohibiting them in the future, restricting the expenditure limits for election campaigns and increasing the controls on broadcasting expenditure for private media. Just in the slide. With regard to reporting, control and sanctions, a detailed review and clarification regarding the framework on electoral funding reporting to be made, and alignment to 2015 law on election and 2005 law on political parties to be noted out, so as to bring campaign financing and non-election period party financing under the same strict disclosure and reporting requirements with their control centralizing into a single authority. As the controller of political finance and an oversight agency, the role of National Audit Office should be made more refined. Introduction of new innovative punishments like law-based subsidies or prison or otherwise increasing the fine in order to strengthen the political financial sanction framework. Just in the slide. Yeah, to conclude, we can say that looking at the trajectory of electoral reforms in Mongolia from 1990 till 2020, it has been discovered that engaging pertinent political issues concerning fair representation of various sections of society, conduct of a free and fair election to financial parity for various parties have intended to influence the procedural democracy in this small landlocked country. The various electoral reforms have gradually guided the political transformation in a smooth manner and tried to carve out a balance between the twin demands of effectiveness and reputation. Moreover, going to the change political scenario, and responsiveness taking the central stage, the political parties in Mongolia have also tried to reform themselves ideologically and structurally. To sum up, we can say that the electoral reforms indeed provided necessary bridge in evolving social democracy in Mongolia, though much more things are still needed.
Thank you, Rajdeep.
Thanks.
My apologies for the little glitches that you had in your presentation. We'll look forward to your questions as they come through.
Okay.
The next presenter is Chandrali Sarkar. She'll be presenting on the trajectory of structural reform of Japanese economy, strategizing package type infrastructure overseas. Ms. Sarkar is a doctoral candidate at the Center for East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Chandrali, the screen is yours.
Thank you. I would like to start by thanking ICS and Shivnadar University for hosting this event and allowing me to present my paper today. I will now share my screen. Hope you can see it. I hope you can see the screen.
It's visible.
Move to full screen mode, that will be easier for you.
Yeah, it is on the full screen mode. So today I will be presenting on the trajectory of structural reform of Japanese economy, strategizing export of package type infrastructure overseas. We have always known Japan has been, the Japanese government has always been measured on the basis of their macroeconomic measures that they have taken. Being stripped of its power to have a military might, it is always structuring and restructuring its economic policies to maintain its position in the global politics. Therefore, structural reform has turned out to be an important factor within Japanese political economy as well as foreign policy. In order to understand about the paper, we first need to understand what structural reforms essentially are. They are basically the measures undertaken by the government to promote balanced growth of the economy, and the structural reforms can be of both sides, both demand-led and supply-led progress. Many studies have always many studies
are you moving your slides? Because nothing is moving.
No, I'm not moving my slide.
Okay, that's all right. Perfect.
It is on the first introductory slide. I hope you can see that. Yeah. So structural reforms are the essential measures undertaken by the government to realize the growth potential. It is basically a structural reform can be address both supply side and demand side to tackle the obstacles to the production, which helps in increasing the productivity and investments within the country. Investments in the country. It can a structural reform. Many studies have shown that the government invest in the supply side of the structural reform, which is basically investing in their infrastructural development, in the technological progress and capital deepening. But there are hardly much studies which shows that there are structural reforms which address the demand side of the economy, which is directly related to the international investments and international trade. Japan's mere obsession with the structural reform, aka growth strategy, started with PM Hayato Aikeda's income doubling plan. This income doubling plan helped in this income doubling plan promised to increase the national income of Japanese economy by 10 years. The purpose of this income doubling plan was to maintain high growth rate by introducing macroeconomic reforms. Another important measure of this income doubling plan was the infrastructure investments, which PM Hayato Aikeda introduced in terms of both demand and supply side progress. As we all know, that the success rate of this income doubling plan set the stage for the successive structural reforms which were introduced in the Japanese economy, and to address the economic stagnation after the bubble burst. And many of the major structural reforms and growth strategies were introduced within the time period of 2010 and 2020. And the next thing is how infrastructure investment was factored within these structural reforms. Infrastructure investments, both in the supply side and the demand side. We only see that the infrastructure investment addressing the demand side of the progress, the intensity of such reforms only increased with each structural reforms over the period of time. This paper traces the trajectory of these growth strategies and how the infrastructure investment was strategized through these structural reforms over the period of time, especially after 2010. In order to do so, the paper is divided into three sections. First is the pre-2010 phase, second is the 2010 to 2013 phase, which is the DPJ phase, and lastly, it is the Abenomics phase. In the 2010 phase, PM Hayato Aikeda introduced his
Chandrali, are you still not moving your slides?
I am moving my slide.
It's not moving for the viewer.
Okay, let me stop sharing and start sharing again. Can you see it?
No.
Please let me know if you want me to share it.
Can you see it now?
Yes, your introduction, and it's not full screen yet. But...
yes. There you go.
Not yet, which is why I'm wondering whether you're... Try and move to the next slide, Chandrali.
I have.
Pre-2010 phase. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So the pre-2010 phase, it is basically it can be divided into two: the post-war structural changes and the post-bubble burst structural changes. The post-war structural changes is basically PM Aikeda's income doubling plan, which introduced appropriate locations for industries and re-examination of regional distribution of public sector projects, where the Japanese government promoted modernization of industries, public sector investments to accelerate development of less developed areas within the country. This was done to maintain the high growth rate, strengthen international competitiveness, and heighten the utility of social capital investments. This particular strategy of growth was also used to strengthen the export competitiveness by developing the infrastructure of the foreign developing markets by investing in their infrastructure. The income doubling plan also proposed for active cooperation with the development of world economy. Japan, wherein the Japanese government actively sought cooperation with the less developed countries in promoting their infrastructural development. And this was an important strategy used for the expansion of the Japanese exports and to increase the revenue in the foreign currency. As a result, we can see that during this period of time, the construction investment within Japan increased steadily and reached 84 trillion yen at its peak in 1992, while the ratio of construction investment to GDP reached 25% at its peak in 1973. We all know about the economic implication of the income doubling plan on Japanese economy, which changed the economy from a war-torn country into a major industrial hub. During this period of time, Japanese ODA also increased tremendously. As in this next slide, we can see the 5 systematic targets of ODA from 1977 to 1991, and the Japanese government increased the amount of money that went into official development assistance to different countries in the Asian region and outside of Asia. The sectoral distribution, this is an important thing that I would like to point out. In the sectoral distribution, much of ODA were directed towards economic infrastructure. Now we come to the post.
4 minutes, Chandrali, and you're still on the pre-2010 phase slide. That's what we are seeing.
The post-bubble burst structural changes here, the Koizumi structural reform of the Japanese economy, basic policy for macroeconomic management. This was introduced when the Japanese economy, this also stressed upon how trade and investments play an important role in the creation of the economic foundation, growth by building infrastructure, post economic liberalization of the Asian region. However, the impact of the Koizumi phase was not long-lasting because of the global financial crisis, which provoked Japan to look for diversify its investments, diversify its exports from the Western markets to the Asian market. As a result, we come to the structural reform during the DPJ phase. During the DPJ phase, three important growth strategies were introduced by Prime Minister Yukio Hatoyama, Prime Minister Naoto Kan, and Prime Minister Yoshiko Noda. The target of these structural changes were quite similar. They were to promote demand-led growth, reduce unemployment by 3 to 4%.
Chandrali, I'm sorry to interrupt. You're still on slide 3, as far as we are.
Okay. Okay.
I don't think your slides are moving, so maybe it'd be easier if ICS just shares your presentation as you go forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you can see the slide now.
Rangoli, can you share the slides, and which slide were you on, Chandrali?
I was in the pre-2010 slide.
Which is number?
Slide number 6.
You do that? Does that work?
Thank you. An increase in the average annual income growth rate, more than 3% in the nominal terms and more than 2% in the real terms. These structural changes open new frontiers in Asia, creating free trade in Asia and Asia Pacific region. All these structural reforms provided importance on exporting package type safe and secure infrastructure in Asia. This was the first time when the export of package type infrastructure investments were introduced in the structural changes. Next slide, please. This was when several government this was when the infrastructure investments were becoming were institutionalized in the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Land and Infrastructure and Transport Tourism, where and because of the creation of these new institutions, we can understand how it became important in terms of Japanese foreign policy as well as in terms of Japanese economic policy. Next slide, please. Now we come to the third phase, which is the Abenomic phase. In the Abenomic phase, Prime Minister Abe went full out in infusing infrastructure investments in his growth strategy. This was also when the infrastructure investment was strategized vis-a-vis the BRI of China. Mr. Abe made expansion of infrastructure overseas as a part of its diplomatic strategy through Japan's revitalization strategy, partnership of quality infrastructure strategy in 2015, and expanded partnership for quality infrastructure strategy in 2016. The government of Japan also encouraged private investments in overseas infrastructure projects. Like his predecessor in the DPJ government, he also promoted private investments in the overseas infrastructure project. The Management Council for Infrastructure Strategy was established in 2013. Creation of global facility to promote quality infrastructure investments for environmental preservation and sustainable growth was also established. Here, lastly, we come to the last slide, where I want to talk about the effects of these structural reforms on Japanese economy. We can see that Japan's ODA stood at a US $16.3 billion in 2020, making Japan the 4th largest donor in the OECD Donor Assistance Committee and the largest in Asia. Japan's infrastructure orders overseas have more than doubled, about 10 trillion yen in 2010 to about 23 trillion yen in 2017. The transportation and infrastructure development respectively increased as well. In terms of the economy, Japan's unemployment, we have seen that Japan's unemployment rate has fell, it fell to 2.7%, which was closer to the target of PM Hatoyama's growth strategy. The growth rate also increased, however, it kept fluctuating over the year. Japan's trade fluctuated from 2010 to 2020. However, it managed to have trade surplus with Asia and the US. However, the Abenomics have also tried to address the Japanese debt crisis, but the debt crisis has only increased and it has only become severe because of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is for the current government to look into how to address the issue of Japanese debt crisis through the structural reforms. Plus, infrastructure investments within the structural reforms have become even more important when we are addressing the contemporary issue of diversifying the supply chain for Japan. And we are trying to manage the supply chain risk associated with the supply of goods and services and checking price volatility. The government also needs to work on the policy of infrastructure investment. This would allow Japan to navigate a pathway for linking value chains in the region by creating a network of reliable and long-term supplies in appropriate capacities. Thank you. So this is my.
Thank you, Chandrali. The final presentation will be by Yukti Panwar. Yukti is presenting a paper that's written jointly with Ashita Kaul on the comparative analysis of socio-political development of women in India and South Korea. Yukti, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me just share the screen. Good morning, everyone. My name is Yukti Pawar, and along with my good friend Ashita Kaur, we wrote this paper on comparative analysis of socio-political development of women in India and South Korea. So the reason why we went for India and South Korea is because both of them are the most prominent post-colonial Asian economy and democracy as of now. India was the colony of Britain, as we all know, and Korea, on the other hand, was the colony of Japan. And the economic development that both of these countries have achieved today has the component of the role played by women in the both of these countries, and this is a very understated role and very powerful role, and therefore we felt the need to highlight that by studying both of these countries in the comparative mode. So what we are trying to prove here is that with increased engagement of women in the political sphere, it has eventually led to better social and economic development of women in both of these nations. So first, we'll just see the trajectory of women's development in India. So in India, during the Vedic period, we through recent studies, we got to know that they were having a lot of liberty in their lives, and they had a lot of say in the public sphere. However, eventually throughout the time, especially during the medieval era, their freedom was highly constricted, and therefore the medieval era can be considered as a dark age. However, during the British colonial era, due to the emergence of reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Pandita Ramabai, Sarojini Naidu, and many others, there was increasing awareness about the issues faced by women, and therefore there was consistent and conscious effort towards introducing laws and changing the thinking of society to ensure that women lead a better lives in India. And this is only progressing towards the positive trend since the independence. However, we have to highlight the fact that even now there are many issues faced by women in India. It includes domestic violence, sexual harassment, malnutrition, female infanticide and feticide, and many others. So, though there is a transformational progress in India over the years, if we see the historical trajectory, however, if it's not, there's still a lot today to do. Yeah, sorry for that. Now we move on to the trajectory of women's development in South Korea. In South Korea, the society has been highly homogeneous and highly influenced by Confucianist thinking. Therefore, it led to a formation of society which is highly patriarchal and has is big on hierarchy. Um and during the period of Japanese colonialism, there was an emergence of women employed in the service sector. And due to the increase of education in women, it has eventually led to increasing awareness in women regarding their rights and the way they were discriminated systematically. And after Korea's liberation from Japan and the Korean War, women in South Korea started to realize their own rights, leading to emergence of women leaders and organizations in the 1960s and 1970s. Another point to highlight here is that in 1960s and 70s, there were a lot of policies introduced by the Korean government to ensure that South Korea is developing economically in an exponential rate, and they were focusing on the export sector. And during that time, they were exploiting the low wage labor force of women to be able to achieve those goals. And it were the organizations of women were both in favor of the government and also radical organizations which were anti-state. And it was the latter which actually played an integral role in 1987 democratization of Korea. And today, South Korea is one of the most developed nations of Asia. However, there are still some major issues which the Korean society faces when it comes to the gender dynamics. It includes sexual harassment in workplace and workplace discrimination. It includes the lack of maternal care, and it also includes the raging force of anti-feminism in South Korea. And we can see the latest manifestation of that in the political sphere with the presidential election that happened just recently, where the president-elect had actually used the force of anti-feminism to garner votes and win the election. Therefore, there's a possibility of increased polarization in South Korea right now. Now we'll just focus on the data. First of all, we'll be focusing on the data related to political participation. We are doing it in two ways. First, we will be looking at the participation of women in national legislative assemblies, followed by the data on proportion of women ministers in both of these countries. So this is the graph on seats held by women in national parliament. Here we can see that in South Korea, which is in the blue line, there's an exponential raise of the number of women in national parliament. It is because of the series of quotas introduced by the Korean government in the 1990s, which ensured that there was a quota for women in various public sectors and also in the national legislative assembly. However, in India, the growth is there, but it is way more staggered compared to South Korea. So, in terms of the political representation, the former political representation in South Korea, they have been ensuring that via ensuring that there are the number of women in the legislative assembly, national parliament, in other words. However, in ministerial position, the trend is reversed. Here, India is the one which has exponential growth. Here we can see in the year 2015, especially India, by expanding its executive and expanding its cabinet over the years, it has ensured that there are more and more women ministers in India. However, in South Korea, there is still a power consolidation and it can be owned to the political structure both of them have. India is a parliamentary executive and South Korea is a presidential executive. That is where there is more concentration of power in terms of the executive in South Korea, and therefore it's less accessible to women as compared to the legislature. In India, the trends are reversed, but both of them together ensure that there has been an increase in political participation of women. Now, the social development of women, the first data that we look into is the Human Development Index, and here we can see that it is coinciding with both the trends of participation of women.
4 minutes, Yukti.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So it is coinciding with both the economic trajectory of the countries and also the political participation rates of women. However, here we have to highlight the fact that India's population is much larger than South Korea, and therefore it has led to India having a little bit lesser numbers than South Korea. Moving on with healthcare access and quality index, it's the similar trends again, and again the demographic composition of India and South Korea are a detrimental because we see these particular trends. Now, the maternal here we see that there is an exponential fall of India's maternal mortality rate over the years. We can owe that to the fact that India's development since the 1990s, and even though it still has a problem of malnutrition among men, it is still showing a ray of hope that there will be a fall in the maternal mortality rate. However, in South Korea, there has been a fall again. However, it has remained pretty low in general because of the fact that there's not much of a problem of malnutrition in South Korea. Now, the economic development, we see the employment of women in different sectors of economy. And here, first focusing on India, we see that the rural population of India is majorly employed in agriculture and there is a fall in female employment in industrial sector while there is a rise in the service sector. But despite the rise in service sector, there is predominance enjoyed by agricultural sector because of the fact that because of the rural-urban divide, and in the rural India, women are employed only in the agricultural sector. However, in South Korea, we see that there is a rise of female employment in service sector, and while there is a fall in the industrial sector, and agriculture remains not so much of a predominant force in contrast to India. And if we notice this, it is actually also corresponding to the macroeconomic structure and the economic development trajectory of both India and South Korea. The last data that we have been looking into is female labor force participation rate. And here the blue line is of India and the red line is on South Korea. The reason why India's female labor force participation rate is still on the downside is because A, of inconsistency of the data available, and B, because of the labor force participation rate of women in informal sector is much higher than the formal sector, and therefore that data is difficult to document and is not documented properly either. In contrast to that, in Korea, the data was documented much more properly and in a consistent manner. That is why we see this difference. And also, we have to note down the fact that the macroeconomic structure of India and South Korea are different and are important detriment of female labor force participation rate. To conclude, female participation in political, economic, and social areas are directly related to one another. If one increases, the other two eventually will increase as well. The current trends show that these two post-colonial countries have increased female participation in governance. And there has been an increase in activism for gender equality, which has significantly contributed to ensure that women are represented in a better manner in the political and public sphere. Though there has been an improvement in HDI index, Human Development Index, and healthcare access and quality index, the progress is gradual and slow, and there is still a lot to do. But there need to be an equal representation of women. There needs to be a consistent progress over time to ensure that women are getting the fair footing in the public and political sphere, and also having a better access to social and economic development of the nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Yukti. Thank you for taking the time. May I now turn to Dr. Basu. Dr. Basu is currently an Associate Fellow at the East Asia Center of the Mukhopadhyay Institute for Different Studies and Analysis. She received a PhD from the Jawaharlal University, and will now be commenting on this variety of papers that have currently been presented. So, Dr. Basu, tough task, but the screen is yours.
Thank you, sir. Very good morning to all of you. And I indeed have a tough task, but it is so refreshing to see such a wide range of papers, not only in terms of the countries covered, but also the issues. So it's kind of fascinating for me and a welcome break from all this hard security matters that I deal with in East Asia. So for the interest of time, I think because of some technical issues, we did lose some time. So I'll just keep it very short, cut the frills and just get to the point. And I'll take up papers not in any particular order. Sorry for that. Whatever is in front of me, the hard copies, I'll just, kind of share my thoughts on them. First, I would start with Professor Radha's paper. She and her team has done a very commendable job. I just hope that the technical glitches has not taken away from the hard work that she and her team has put into this paper. The one, I think the strength of the paper lies in the statistical tools that have been used. It's quite a rigorous research that has been done. But, when I look into any conversation on India, ASEAN, particularly trade matters, I can't help, maybe because of my geopolitical orientation, I can't help but situate the conversation in the larger context of, the politics around mega FTAs that we are seeing, because these are not just FTAs, but also important strategic tools in the great power game. So I kind of situate this entire scenario that is going on between India and ASEAN in terms of trade. I can't help but situate it with RCEP coming into effect this year. And also we must remember that a couple of ASEAN countries are also members of CPTPP. So ASEAN is a highly integrated region for a very long time in terms of value chains and production networks. And India has been, truth be told, I hope that her conclusions are proved right in the medium to long term, where she has argued that, that India could be a major replacement for China to ASEAN countries in terms of manufacturing. I think I would be delighted if that happens. But as I see it in ground reality, we have our own issues when we are trying to plug into the global manufacturing ecosystem, and we are putting in place, the policy measures that, of course, will take some time. Integrating into the global value chain has not been an easy task for India. And with RCEP coming into effect, I think she has cited some studies of RIS, of course, a very reputed institute when it comes to trade matters. And I kind of agree partially that, it's Japan and the other three, like the +3, though RCEP is a very, ASEAN-centric mechanism. It started that way, but then big economies came in, and the conversation is China-driven now within RCEP. But I think it's true that Japan will be one of the biggest beneficiaries. But I kind of have some cautious reservations if one argues that ASEAN itself will not be a beneficiary of it. I don't think they would have entered into an FTA where there are no trade-offs for them. And RCEP, I think, in the post-pandemic era, it holds immense potential in terms of crucial elements in post-pandemic recovery. For example, accelerating and enhancing global value chains through single rule of origin framework, and also digital transformation will be key. So I think when I situate the India-ASEAN trade story in this larger game, I would be a little cautious. If my only suggestion will be that if also the larger context can be brought into the paper, I think it will, the story will be better told, and come out with some policy recommendations which will be very useful for both academics and also for the policy makers, given the statistical tools that she has used, she and her team. So again, I compliment the authors for this wonderful paper. Now, as I mentioned, I will move to the next paper, and I think next I have Chandrali's paper. I think she has been extremely thorough in her research in terms of decoding all the structural reforms that has been happening decade-wise, which is a very commendable job. I just have, two suggestions for her to consider. Obviously, she has defined that the scope of her study kind of probably, if I remember correctly, ends in 2020. I think when you're talking about infrastructure, it's very important, I think, to kind of increase the shelf life of your paper or the book chapter, whatever you are pursuing this publication. I think for a better shelf life, you should also incorporate, the story after the pandemic, because so much has changed. And I'm sure you will find a lot of interesting developments that have happened, because I was looking into, the overseas infrastructure system promotion strategy that METI has come out from 2021 to 2025. So if you look at that as well, I think it will give a very holistic picture that where this story of structural reforms and infrastructure that you have tried to bring in together is heading in the post-pandemic world. So maybe, you can increase the scope maybe towards the end and incorporate, because new policies are coming in every day. And if you look at this 2021 to 2025 strategy, of course, we have seen primacy of carbon neutrality, digital transformation, gaining more primacy into the policy conversation. And also, of course, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, have always been mainstream. But I think it has received some further thrust in the post-pandemic era. And of course, we have seen intensification of the infrastructure game in the Indo-Pacific. So I think maybe if you could look into that, the new infrastructure systems overseas promotion strategy, it may be useful for you. And also another point that I would make, because since you're situating the infrastructure story in the larger economic restructuring of Japan, I think you may also like to explore the contours of the new capitalism that Kishida is talking about. Do you see any potential, how it is situated? Are there any constraints, or it's an enabling process? I think these are more futuristic things which will give a longer life to your paper. I think, but then again, I think you have done a very thorough job, and I'm very happy and delighted to read your paper. Coming to, I think, I have Ms. Yukti's paper, I think, on the comparative analysis of the socio-political development of women and women in India and South Korea. I think it's a fascinating, topic yet again. And she and her friend, I think Ashita, has done a wonderful job of it. My only worry is that, not worry, but the only thing I would like to flag is that, women's participation is not an end in itself. I mean, the quality of politics that women bring in is also important. I mean, you have looked into some of the indicators in terms of, Human Development Index and all, but, there are many variables that adds to Human Development Index, and it's not just women participation. The case in point is, we have seen the fall from grace and the quality of politics that came into Korea under President Park Geun-hye, and I think you have mentioned in your paper about she being the first president. But then she comes from a very privileged background, and then the quality of my worry is the quality of politics that comes into play, and it is not a gender issue. I know I don't think men are very great in that, but then I think these are very nuanced things that one should keep in mind when we are taking women and the kind of contribution that we are making in any sphere. I think you have given the numbers in terms of political participation. I think another way of looking at it, you have passingly mentioned about the labor force. Maybe look at the corporate structure, because how women are in the are they the thought leaders? Are they bringing in valuable decisions which are being taken or considered seriously? So I think that will paint a more holistic picture in terms of of the progress that we have made. But anyway, it's a very interesting paper that I really enjoy. Coming to I think Shubhangi's paper, excellent presentation, I must say, and it's quite interesting that you have talked about just transition. I think it's applicable in every developing economy today. And you have cited some examples also, but I don't think you have time. Otherwise, I would have asked you a little more about it, about just transition. But I think I'll just flag two things. I completely agree with your conclusion about, that the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach has to meet somewhere for effective policies to be made. And I think you have talked about in the conclusion, probably I was seeing that you mentioned about not letting the corporation lead the green capitalism. My hunch is that while all the stakeholders, civil society, grassroots mobilization is as important as anybody else, but when it comes to real deliverables, I think in terms of R&D, in terms of technology development and technology dissemination, the role of private sector is very pertinent, because the kind of money they pump in terms of green technologies, that is something which cannot happen from the civil society. But civil society is an important check. They check and balance on them, as you have rightly brought out. But I think a little more credit to the contribution of the corporations in terms of technology is due. Also, I would urge you to look at, you have mentioned about the incoming president-elect that we are all waiting for in May. He's going to assume office. He has some interesting perspective on nuclear energy and renewable energy. So how South Korea, do you see any transition or shifts, that will something future scenarios. What are the future scenarios you envision is something that maybe you can consider for your paper. And I think the last paper was on Mongolia. It's a fascinating paper, I would say, because Mongolia, I'm first of all, I'm delighted to learn that somebody in India is looking so closely into the domestic politics of Mongolia, tracking numbers, tracking, all the electoral reforms. It's excellent job, and I think it holds a lot of promise, because there are not many of us in India who is so closely looking at Mongolia as Rajdev did. So it's quite encouraging. But interest of time, I think we are already we overshot the time. I think one thing that struck me in your paper is you have talked about, this electoral mechanism has kind of strengthened the democratic ideals in the region. So that is something which, kind of caught my attention and kind of sparked my interest, because you have shown the geography of Mongolia also. So, I mean, in the neighborhood, how is it, spreading or strengthening democratic ideals in terms of tangible, examples? I would be interested in knowing that and learning a bit more about it from you. But anyway, I'll stop here. And I know all of you have a lot of questions for all the authors. So thank you, sir. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Basu. Rija, do we have about 5 minutes?
Yes, sir. We can extend it by 5 minutes.
Sure. So let me quickly then give a minute each to each of the speakers to respond in some sense, and also sort of, if you have been following the questions in the chat box, Shubhangi, I think you had an earlier question from Jabin, and also some recent questions in place. Can you see them, or should I?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
You can see them. So, yes. In which case, both from Professor Mishra and Professor Jacob, if you can respond to that, and then you have 3 questions. I'll let you go first, and then Yukti, you have a couple more questions, and then I'll have Chandrali and Radha and Rajdeep make closing remarks in case you have that. Please, screen's yours, Shubhangi.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for the feedback, ma'am. I saw 2 questions, one from Jacob sir and one from Sandeep sir. So I'll answer them together. This also combines Basu ma'am's feedback. So recently, South Korea had its election wherein People's Power Party came in, which is a conservative party. And however, there's a notion out there that conservative parties do not tend to lean towards green economy or green transformations. However, in South Korea, this was one of the major talk points here during the election campaigning. So the previous party, which was the Liberal Democratic Party, President Moon, he called upon shutting down nuclear reactors in order to move towards renewable energy. However, the current president-elect, President Yoon, he talked about bringing in carbon neutrality, by pushing in carbon neutrality through bringing in nuclear reactors and by investing in them, and also investing in green technology and exports in them. So I think the approach will change a little bit with the coming of the new president. However, the aim is going to remain the same. What I feel is also about to change is that the things I mentioned about learning lessons from the green growth, which was especially about lessons from the green growth, which was especially about not letting the economy turn into a green technology export economy. So I think that is not going to happen now. The same is going to continue with the coming in of this new party and new president. Thank you.
Thank you, Shubhangi. Yukti, could you go next, please?
Oh, yes, sir. Thank you so much.
I only got one question from Professor Sandeep, which was asking about why did we select India and South Korea to compare. I'll answer that while also responding to the feedback that Dr. Basu mentioned. First of all, thank you for that feedback. We know that the topic is very expansive and has a lot of elements to consider, like the quality of political process and everything. However, we felt that we are starting somewhere, and we will be definitely working in future projects and expanding our domain in this area. And why we selected India and South Korea is, so one reason is that India and South Korea today, geopolitically speaking, in many other ways, are the most prominent democracies, economies, and also are playing an integral role in the geopolitics of Indo-Pacific at this moment. And their progress speed is very fast, which got hampered due to the pandemic. But however, there is hope for both of these countries, and both of these countries are post-colonial countries, and it's an unusual combination that you see to be compared, which is exactly why we went for it. Both of the countries have faced a division of their territory at the moment they got independent, with Korean War for South Korea and for partition in India and Pakistan. So there are like a lot of differences.
Yukti, may I intervene? I think just please don't try to answer, just think about it. And because you need to have convincing reasons. It's not that you can say that because Korea, there's I in Korea, there is I in India kind of thing. Okay, think about it.
Yes, sir, yes, sir.
Don't need to answer. Just think that why did I? Because when you are doing a research, people will ask, why did you choose these only two countries? There could be any two countries.
Yes,
to think about, and if you have answer, then you come. It's okay.
Yes, sir. I do have an answer. I just wanted to mention that I feel that India and South Korea both have a lot of potential, and we are seeing an increasing prominence of both of these nations, and therefore it is important to analyze the countries within Asia as well, especially, and also in Africa, without having the Eurocentric narrative of political papers, which was why I got more.
Yukti, so I think it's a perfectly valid answer to say that you were interested in Korea and India, therefore you started to look at it.
Yes,
and
sir.
that I think
Yes,
is,
sir. And to
fair
move away
enough
from the
that,
general trend.
that story going forward. But there are, as Professor Mishra is pointing out, other reasons why you might want to look at it. You mentioned patriarchy in both these countries, etc. So it might be useful for you to sort of look at them.
That is also a reason. And both of them have
through Professor Mishra's questions. Now, Chandrali, Rajdeep, and Radha, would you like to respond to any of these? If you have to, it'll be very quick. So, or else, of course. Yeah. Chandrali, you want to? Yes, go ahead.
I do not have any question, but thank you, Titli, for your comments. Yes, I will include the post-2020, the structural changes and the reforms that were introduced in the post-2020 phase after the pandemic. Here, I had only kept the time limit from 2010 to 2020, basically, assessing how these structural changes have affected the economy of Japan. But yeah, I will look into that. So I'll probably include a post-pandemic or pandemic phase and make it more constructive. Thank you.
Thank you, Chandrali. Rajdeep and Dr. Radha, would you have something to respond?
Yeah, thank you, sir. And I completely agree with the suggestions that are given by the discussant. And surely we'll try to incorporate that when we are finally publishing the paper. And I do completely agree that Regional Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement is going to have a very important bearing on all the economies. And we had our own reasons for not going with that. And I surely agree that it is one of the important determinant of is going to be of ASEAN trade. And we also need to look with respect to the FTA agreement that we have with ASEAN. And I completely agree with the suggestions given by the discussant. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Radha. It's about contextualizing the paper a little bit more, and of course also perhaps highlighting the corporate sector investments in both these countries, which are the things that will be necessary if you want to be actually part of value chains in terms of structuring your underlying real comparative advantage kind of analysis. And finally, Rajdeep, would you like to see something? No? In which case, we'll now hand over back to, yes, Rajdeep, you had something to say? You are muted, so we can't hear you. If you want to say something electronically.
Now, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Yes, sir. So thank you for the feedback. And I would like to conclude my paper with the saying that in the historical timeline, we find that adopting of Constitution 1992 was a major milestone for the Mongolia, and subsequent electoral reforms and shifting electoral systems from 1992 to 2020, we find that these democratic ideals have brought a kind of ideological as well as structural changes, not only in the party system or in the democratic sector, or in the democratic setup of the country, but also a kind of structural changes within the political parties. For example, MPRP, now it is MPP, Mongolia's People Party. It has set the name, it has set the term revolutionary from it, and try to imbibe capitalist ideals and try to incorporate those things in its propaganda. So we see that with the shifting time, there are certain changes. There are certain changes like adopting capitalist values and opening their party boundaries to so as to make the representation more and more inclusive. Then there was democratic party.
It is obviously looking at democratization in an area where there is such a large party dominance, but of course now with Mongolia sort of having a fairly wide, trying to reach out much widely across many dimensions, that'd be nice. Unfortunately, we can't. Lovely discussion. I wish we could continue this further. May I now hand it back to Surabhi, but first to conclude. But first, warm and thanks to the speakers, Rajdeep, Yukti, Chandrali, Radha, and Shubhangi, and of course Dr. Basu for taking the time to read through those papers carefully and offer great framing suggestions that will help, I'm sure, present these papers better when they go into publication. And thank you very much to AICEAS for having me and organizing this session. Surabhi, back to you.
Thank you, sir. Let me conclude this session by thanking the chair, Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay, the discussants, Dr. Titli Basu, and the 4 panelists for joining us. We would also like to thank all for bearing with all the technical difficulties during the session. The video recordings of all our sessions will be available on our ICS YouTube channel. We shall now have a break for 15 minutes and resume at 11:15 for our third special panel.
Surabhi, we don't have a break. We'll start at 11:15 dot.
Okay. So we'll see you. We'll continue with this. Please note that the meeting room will remain open. So please stay by. Thank you for logging in. Have a good day.
Hello, Bala sir.
Venkat, I think the speakers for the next session has already joined. They have joined.
Yes, they have.
Yeah. Rija.
Yes, sir.
My suggestion would be that we can continue.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We are. The speakers have already joined.
Yeah, Venkat there, Bala said there.
Yeah, we'll just need a couple of minutes.